At this point, we have a working front end and a working back end for our full stack application. Now, since both the front and the back end are written in JavaScript, it makes sense to persist our data in a database that plays very nicely with JavaScript. And for that, we need to look no further than MongoDB. Now, MongoDB is what we call a non-relational database, which means that we can basically just push data into it without worrying too much about how that data is formatted. And this is in contrast to MySQL and other SQL-based databases that have pretty strict requirements for the format of the data they store. So in the case of MongoDB, MongoDB plays particularly well with JavaScript because we're able to just store JavaScript objects in MongoDB and retrieve them later. Whereas with MySQL, that's usually not so much the case. So anyway, that's why we're going to be using MongoDB with our project, just because it works so well with JavaScript. So let's get started and see how we can add this to our project. Now that we know what MongoDB is and what we're going to use it for, let's get an instance up and running. And in order to do this, first of all, it is possible to have a local MongoDB instance running on your computer. But since we're currently developing in Codespaces, we're going to jump straight to using MongoDB on the cloud. Now, if you want to download the MongoDB shell and use it locally on your own computer, you can download and install it at the URL shown on the screen. Now, setting up MongoDB in the cloud is pretty straightforward. So what you're going to want to do is search for MongoDB Atlas, and you may need to create an account in order to access it. It's currently free at the time of recording. And once you get to a page that looks like this, where it has all of your current projects listed out, and you probably won't have any yet, what you're going to want to do is create a new project. So find the button that says New Project and click Create. And what we're going to do is give our project a name. So we'll call this something like Full Stack Vue. And then we're going to click Next. And then it's going to ask us to add members to our database. And we're actually just going to skip that for now and click Create Project. Alright, so now that we've created that new project, what we're going to have to do is add a database to our project. This is just going to be a running instance of MongoDB that we'll be able to communicate with from our server and do things like store our data inside of it, manipulate our data, etc. So what you're going to want to do next is click on this Build a Database button, and then you're going to want to select the free option all the way over to the right-hand side here and make sure they haven't switched that around on you. You're just going to want to look for the word that says free, obviously. And let's click the Create button here, and that will create a new shared cluster for us. So it's going to give us a few options. What I'm going to do is just leave AWS selected here. And then for the region, you're going to want to select the geographic region that's closest to you. So for me, that's going to be North Virginia. I'm going to leave that selected and click Create Cluster. Alright, so that might take a little while. And you're going to see this M0 cluster provisioning thing down in the corner. That just means that MongoDB is currently configuring your cluster and it's about to run it. Alright, and once you see the message that says your cluster has finished provisioning, we can now start working with our database. So what we're going to want to do is connect to our database that we just created from inside Codespaces. And specifically, we're going to want to open up a terminal and connect to it from there. So you might just want to create a new terminal by clicking this plus sign. And in order to connect to MongoDB from inside a terminal, we're going to have to install the Mongo Shell command line interface. And in order to do that, there are different ways you can do this, of course. But the easiest way is going to be to use a tool called Homebrew. So you're going to want to search for this tool. Currently the URL is brew.sh. And what it does is it just gives you this command that you can copy and paste into your terminal. So I'm going to do that here and run it. And that will install Homebrew in your Codespaces instance. So you're just going to want to hit return or enter. And it might take a little while to complete. So while that's downloading and installing for us, what we're going to want to do is make a few changes to the data that we'll be adding to our database. So remember that earlier when we added data to our backend in the form of this tempdata.js file, we commented out all of the image name properties for our products. Now, the reason that we did this is because the images are going to work a little bit differently on the backend than they are when you just store the images on the front end. Alright. So what we're going to need to do here is change the image name properties for all of our products so that instead of image name, it's going to be image URL. And the value for this is going to be a pretty consistent thing for all of our images. What it's going to be is /images/ and then the name of the file. So for our basil bottle olive oil here, it's going to be /images/basilbottle.web. And then we'll do the same thing for the rest of our products. And once we've done that, we're going to remove all of the imports up at the top since we no longer need to do that. And now that we've done that, hopefully Homebrew is done installing, and it looks like it is. So one thing that you're going to need to make sure you do in order to be able to run the correct commands here is, in all of this stuff that Homebrew printed out while it was installing, you'll see this comment that says, run these 3 commands in your terminal to add Homebrew to your path. You're just going to want to copy all of those and run them in your terminal. And there we go, we're going to paste them and hit enter. And now we should be able to run the command brew. And you should see basically all of the options printed out. Okay. If you see output saying something like brew command not found, then something didn't go quite right during the installation process and you should try it again. Cool, so now that we have Homebrew, we're going to use Homebrew to install the Mongo shell tool in our terminal. And we can do that by saying brew install mongosh, and we're going to hit enter. And that will take another minute or 2 to install that tool. Now, if you don't already have a MongoDB Atlas account, you're going to want to follow the URL on the screen to MongoDB Atlas and create one. And once that finishes, you should be able to run the command mongosh, and you'll see some sort of output there, even if it's an error. So what we're going to do next is use this tool to connect to the Mongo instance that we created in Mongo Atlas. Alright, so now that we've installed the MongoSH tool and set up a MongoDB instance on MongoDB Atlas, the next thing that we're going to do is connect to MongoDB Atlas and insert some data into it that our application will be able to use. So the first thing that we're going to have to do is open up the MongoDB Atlas tab that we had open. And inside the project that we created called Full Stack Vue, you're going to want to create a new username and password for your database, right? So this is going to be the username and password that our server is going to end up using to connect to MongoDB. So what you're going to want to do is just enter in a username of some sort. It doesn't really matter what it is, as long as you can use it on your server. So I'm just going to call this something like Full Stack Vue Server. And for the password, you're going to want to enter in something there. And in fact, I'd recommend using auto-generate secure password. But for now, just to make things easier for me, since I'm going to be sharing my screen this whole time, I'm just going to put in a very simple password that I will make sure to go back and change later. So once you've entered that, you're going to want to click Create User. And once we've created that user, we're going to use that user to connect with the Mongo shell tool. But before that will actually work, we're going to need to go into the Network Access tab here, over on the left-hand side. And in order to allow ourselves to connect from Codespaces, we're going to need to allow ourselves to connect from anywhere, so let's click Add IP Address. And what you're going to want to do is click on this option Allow Access from Anywhere, and then we're going to click Confirm. And that should make it possible to connect from Codespaces. So now that we've done that, let's go up to our Database tab at the top. Alright, and inside this database that we just created here, you're going to want to click on the Connect button, which will provide us with some very handy copy and paste instructions for connecting to the database from our Codespaces shell. So you're going to select Connect with the MongoDB shell. That's the first option here. And that's going to give you some instructions. First of all, obviously it says brew install MongoSH. We did that already. So down here, you're going to want to copy this command that starts with mongosh, and then it has a big URL. We're just going to copy that. And now, we're going to go back over to our Codespaces terminal. And paste that command we just copied. So notice here that it has the username specified that we just created. And once we hit enter, it's going to ask us for our password. So that's just going to be the password that you entered beforehand, whatever you had there. And if you forgot it already, then you're going to have to go back and create another user with another password. So let's hit enter now. And what you should see is that will successfully connect to MongoDB. And you'll now see that there's this different shell prefix here that says Atlas, blah, 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 my first database. Alright, so we are now inside the database that we created on MongoDB Atlas. So the next thing that we're going to do, as I said, is we're going to insert data into this database. And in order to do that, the first thing that we're going to want to do is switch to the database we want to use. So all we have to do in order to make that happen is say use. And then we're going to type in a database name, right? This is really just for organizational purposes. So what we're going to do is just call it something like full-stack vuedb, and hit enter. And you should see that it says switch to dbfsvdb. So the use command in the MongoDB shell is how you switch from one database to another. And now that we're inside our specific project database that we just created, we're going to insert some data. So what we're going to want to do is take all of the data that we've had hard-coded in our backend, and store it in our database. And as we've already mentioned, this will allow us to persist our data in a more permanent way. So we're going to copy all of the product's data. And you're just going to want to copy the square brackets and everything inside of them. So let's go and get those. We're going to copy that. And then in our shell, what we're going to do is say db.products.insertMany. And in parentheses there, we're going to paste everything that we just copied. And we're going to select paste here. And then we're going to make sure to close the parentheses and hit enter. And what we should see is that it outputs this object that says acknowledge true, which means that everything went well with the command we just ran in the shell. And then underneath that we see inserted IDs. These are the random IDs that MongoDB has automatically assigned to each of the products that we just inserted. So that command that we just ran, write db.products.insertMany, that's going to have the effect of inserting many documents. And these are called documents, by the way. When they're inside MongoDB, that's going to have the effect of inserting many documents into a new collection called products, okay? Alright, so now that we've inserted all of our products into MongoDB, the next thing that we're going to want to do is insert our shopping cart data into MongoDB. And the way that we're going to do this is a little bit different than the way that we've been doing it in our temporary data. And what we're going to do is instead of inserting this data into a collection called cart, we're going to create a new collection called users, which will just contain some random user IDs. And as part of the data in that collection, we'll have an array of product IDs that user has added to their carts. So don't worry if that sounds a little bit confusing. All that's going to look like for now is we're going to say db.users.insert1. Okay, so this is like insert many. But when we only want to insert a single record. And the user that we're going to insert is going to have an ID of something like 1 2 3 4 5. And it's also going to have a property called cart items, which will be the value that we had up here. So that can just be an array with 123 and 345 inside of it. And that's going to be the user we'll insert. So let's close the curly braces and the parentheses and hit enter. And we should see a similar output there that says acknowledge true and inserted ID. So now that we have our user inserted and our products inserted, we should be able to move on to working with our database in our Node server, instead of just working with this fake temporary data that we've been working with before. So before we move on, I just wanted to mention a few more commands that you can use in the MongoDB shell to help you navigate. If you want to see all of the items that are currently in a given collection, well, that's pretty easy to do. All you have to do is say db. And then the collection name, so products. For example, and then .find. Alright, and you're going to pass an empty object to that as an argument. And if you hit enter, that's going to show you all of the items that are currently in that collection. Alright, so that's just an easy way to see what data your database contains. And we can also say db.users.find. And what we'll see is that will show us all of the users in our users collection. So anyway, now that we have our Mongo database set up, we should be able to link up our Express app to it. Now that we've inserted all of our data into our Mongo database instance on Mongo Atlas, the next thing that we're going to do is see how to connect to MongoDB and load data on our Express server. So let's open up our server file, right? That's going to be inside backend in source. And what we're going to need to do first is install what's called the MongoDB driver, right? This is just an npm package that allows us to connect to MongoDB and provide some helpful methods and functions for doing so. So what we're going to do is inside our backend, and again, you're going to want to make sure that you're in your backend directory when you run this command. You're going to want to run npm install, there we go. And the name of this package is called MongoDB. So let's hit enter and that will install that package for us. And once it's done installing, we're going to import something from that package up at the top of our server file. Now, the way that this works in MongoDB is we're going to import something called MongoClient, which is just a class that we can create new instances of, as you'll see. And that's going to be imported from MongoDB like so. And what we're going to do now is toward the top of our server file, before we define our Express app and any of the endpoints, we're going to create a new instance of that MongoClient class we just imported by saying const client equals new MongoClient. And the way that this works now is we have to pass the URL to this MongoClient constructor of the Mongo database we want to connect to. So this is actually pretty similar to what we did in the Mongo shell. And what you can do in order to find this URL again is go over to Database Deployments, and we're going to click on Connect for our full stack Vue cluster again. So let's click Connect there. And now instead of clicking Connect with the MongoDB shell, we're going to say Connect your application. And now you should see that it says driver, Node.js, and the version says 4.1 or later. And down here you'll see the URL that you want. So let's copy that, and we're going to go back to our server and in backticks, right? That's a little bit different from single quotes because it allows you to insert values into strings in JavaScript. What we're going to do is paste that URL. And yes, it is a rather lengthy URL. So what some people actually like to do is define the URL separately by saying const URL equals. And let's just do that here to make it more readable. We're going to cut that URL out and paste it there next to the variable name. And notice that this includes the username that we defined before as well as the password. Alright. Now the first thing you should know about this password is what you don't want to do is just type your password into here and then publish this to GitHub. If you do want to use GitHub for this project, you'll definitely want to make sure that it's a private GitHub repo and not a public GitHub repo. This is just an option that you can select while creating a new repo on GitHub. Now, this is my password here. Again, I'm going to be very careful to shut down my MongoDB instance after I'm done recording. Now, if for whatever reason you need to use a public GitHub repo and you can't use a private GitHub repo, what you want to do instead is assign this password to an environment variable and reference only the environment variable from inside this string. So I'll show you how to do that later on when we see how to publish our application. But for now, I'm just going to put the password into there. So if you do the same thing and you're following along, just make sure that you don't commit your code and then publish that to GitHub. Cool, so now that we have our URL and client defined, we're going to insert our URL and pass that as an argument to our MongoClient constructor. Alright. And now that we have this client thing here, what we're going to want to do is allow ourselves to connect to it each time we need it. So basically, inside each of our server endpoints we're going to need to use that client object to create a connection, and then we can use that open connection to make requests to MongoDB. So what we're going to need to do, and I'll just show this inside the hello endpoint here for the time being. What we're going to need to do is say await client.connect. Okay, and we're going to use the async and await keywords here. Don't worry if you haven't worked with those. It's pretty straightforward. And once we've connected to the client, we can get a reference to the database that we want by saying const db equals client.db and then the name of the database we want to work with. In that case, remember, that's going to be fsvdb. And this db object is very similar to the db object that we were able to use in the Mongo shell. We can now use it by saying something like db.collection. And if we wanted to access, let's say the products collection, we could say products, and then we can use .find1 or .find in order to find documents in that collection that match a certain piece of criteria. So if we wanted to find all of the products in the products collection, we could just say db.collectionProducts.find. And the way that we could get the result of that would be by saying const products equals await. And since this is asynchronous as well, then db.collection.find. And as a matter of fact, the result of this find operation in Node.js doesn't give us an array, which we actually want an array. So what you can do to convert it automatically is you can add .toArray on the end. And that is important for us in this case. So at this point, we have all of our products. So what we're going to do is send those back to the client as response. So we'll say response.sendProducts. And you might have noticed that the await keywords have this little red underline, and that's just because whenever we use the await keyword, it has to be inside a function marked with the async keyword. That's just how those keywords work in JavaScript. So if we add that to the callback function, you'll see that those go away. And we should now be able to send a request to this hello endpoint by going back to Postman, changing the request type to GET, and sending our request to /hello. So let's click send now. And oops, it looks like it's not working because we need to start our server. So let's start our server here by saying npm run dev. Alright, that's the script we defined earlier. And oops, it looks like we got an error of some kind. I believe that's just because I left this extra greater than sign in there. So let's remove that. And now we should see that it says server is listening on port 8000. So let's try this one more time. We're going to go back to our Postman. Click send, and sure enough, we should see all of our products from our products collection displayed as part of the response. So that's how to connect to MongoDB from inside an Express application and make simple queries to it. Give feedback.